Language is the foundation of civilization. It is the glue that holds a people together. It is the first weapon drawn in a conflict. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 4 of season 6. We are continuing our series about close encounters with aliens, this time with the film Arrival.
So this is our 4th episode of season 6. It is also our 4th episode on aliens. So we started off this season talking about War of the Worlds, the classic book, and the Orson Welles interpretation on the radio. And then we talked about, we kind of shifted to alien encounter or abduction narratives with the 1990s movie Fire in the Sky, and then the much more recent Vast of Night from 2019. And now we are looking at a different kind of alien encounter movie, Arrival, which came out in 2016. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the movie Arrival, and then I guess I'll give my impressions, and then we'll kind of pass around our impressions and then talk a little bit about the movie and how this maybe relates to this particular theme. So the movie Arrival was based on a story by Ted Chiang, The Story of Your Life, which I have to say I've been meaning to read for a while and have not, but I imagine it's very good. I've heard great things about his work. The movie was written by Eric, I'm assuming that's pronounced Heiserer, and he wrote the horror movie Lights Out, actually, which came out the same year as Arrival, if listeners are familiar with that movie. So I guess that's kind of an interesting connection to our topic of kind of darker things or horror of this podcast. And then it was directed by Denis Villeneuve, which I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. But he has been in the news a lot recently because he is the director of Dune, the recent Dune adaptation. And he also directed Blade Runner 2049. The movie is starring Amy Adams, and it focuses on aliens coming to Earth and then, well, how people react to that. And because it's very mysterious, we can't communicate with them, of course. And then Amy Adams is a linguist who ends up being brought on by the military to work with some scientists to try to communicate with the aliens, to try to figure out what their language is or how we can communicate with them. And so one of the interesting things that we have in our notes here is that the director and the writer of this film actually worked on creating a functional visual language for the movie. So the aliens actually end up using their writing to communicate with us, like people of Earth, because their spoken language, there's this kind of break. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through it. My thoughts on Arrival, I remember seeing it in the theater, and I feel like this actually, me sitting down and watching it a few nights ago for this episode, was my only other time watching it. I remember loving it in the movie. I remember that part where you kind of figure out what's going on toward the end. It was just so surprising, and the end is very emotional. I really, really enjoy this movie, and I enjoyed watching it again. It is very well done. I love the way the aliens were kind of constructed and thought out. I feel like when we see them, there's no, I don't feel let down at all. They are very alien. And one of the things I was thinking about this time, especially after we talked about Vast of Night, was just the way that cosmic fear and awe are kind of used in this movie. There are times when they're really awesome in the original term of the word and beautiful things happening. And yet there's still that tension because lack of communication can be scary, as our quote that Matt read leading us into this episode showed us. So, yeah, I mean, I guess as a humanities nerd, a movie where linguistics becomes the way to kind of save us is really interesting. And I also like the background portrayal of what people might do if aliens came that goes on in the film as well. So Matt, Lisa, what do you guys think? What's been your experience with this movie, and what are your first impressions?
I actually did not see this movie in the theaters like you did. I saw it once it had come out on streaming, I think. And it was one of those that I think the first time I turned it on, I had to turn it off right away because I was like, oh, this is a movie you pay attention to. Which I'm very guilty about turning things on in my home, especially now we have all these streaming services. I'm very guilty about turning a movie on and then going and doing something else and not paying attention. So this was one of those movies I was like, oh, I'm going to have to really, really kind of pay attention because it's doing something cool. And I watched it and I was not disappointed. I think I got more out of it this time, which was the second time I've seen it than I have before. And I've read the story that it's based on. I think I read the story it's based on after I saw it the first time, and then I revisited the story. This is one of those movies. Okay, first of all, Mel, I completely agree. I love it that we get to see like a linguist be a hero of this type of movie and get to save the day, because I feel like we don't see that a whole lot. We don't get to see, I mean, especially a female professor save. I mean, she does. She saves the day in this movie, so that's fun to see. But also the way that she pays attention to how language is constructed and why that's important. That and it kind of that idea of communication and how easily communication can break down and can have catastrophic effects if you're not careful. I love that that's what this movie was based on. And I enjoyed it even more the second time, kind of watching it and knowing that's what this was about, at least in part. But beyond that, I think the thing that I really appreciate about this movie is that it's a really good adaptation. The story itself is well worth a read. The story of your life. It's absolutely a beautiful story, and this movie is a beautiful movie. So it's kind of a win-win because it's a great story, it's a great movie, and that is very rare that happens. So I don't know. I was really kind of pleased to see that. And then I guess the last thing I'll say about it is I like that this is both a wide scale kind of alien invasion. It's happening all over the world, but then at the same time, this is a very intimate alien encounter story. And I like that they kept that. I like that they kept it very intimate, especially with her encounters with the aliens and what that meant and how it changed things. I mean, we do, like you said, get kind of the bits and pieces of what's happening in the world, but I like that wasn't the focus. I liked kind of keeping it close in with Dr. Banks as the main kind of engine that's driving the story. So, and then the story in and of itself really isn't about aliens at all, is it? It's kind of about a mother and a daughter, which is also wonderful. There's so many layers. I love it. I'm curious to hear what Matt has to say.
Well, like you, Lisa, I did not see this movie in the theaters. I know I had wanted to see it in the theaters when it came out, but for whatever reason, I wasn't able to make it while it was still on the theatrical run. So I didn't see it until it came out for rent or was on streaming. I think it was just streaming at that time. And I mean, I absolutely loved it. It was the first movie I've ever seen that was directed by Villeneuve, and like the style and the tone struck me almost immediately. I mean, it was very, very well done and gorgeously shot. And I was kind of saying this before we started recording too, when we were just kind of chatting about the movie, that it feels like everything in the movie has a weight to it in a really good way. I haven't read the source material. I knew that it was based on that story, but it's something I have not had a chance to. Now that I've rewatched this movie, I do want to go and read the story again. So I'm going to try to do that before I get sidetracked again. But yeah, I think like both of you, I was really nerding out at the idea of language being kind of the centerpiece of this movie, and especially the way that the written language for these aliens, the septapods as they're called, which I'm sure we can get more into there, but the way that it's non-linear, it's cyclical, it's a circle, and that becomes very important as we come to understand how they experience time as well. And without getting too far ahead of it, I feel like there was something about this movie and the way that it deals with time that reminded me a bit of the movie 12 Monkeys. They're very, very different movies, but there's something about just the I don't know, the physics or the metaphysics or whatever of it that just reminds me about 12 Monkeys. And I haven't ever been able to really put my finger on it, but maybe that's something we can talk about when we kind of get to the way that the aliens represent time. But that's kind of my first impression. Loved it then. Rewatching it just reminded me how much I loved it. And I definitely did pick up more stuff on this second watching of it than the first time.
Yeah, I definitely recommend watching this movie multiple times because I remember watching it in the theater and being blown away by what they did with time, but like thinking back on getting how it worked, but also not at the same time. Of course, time travel and paradoxes like make my head hurt, but even though I love time travel narratives, watching it this time, I saw how like the prologue of the movie was a prologue, and because the movie itself is told in this kind of cyclical time. The very beginning, you have Amy Adams narrating about how memory is a strange thing. We are so bound by time and its order. And you realize at the end of the movie that the beginning of the movie wasn't like quite the beginning of the movie. And I just love that. I love that complexity and kind of the beauty of it too, because I think you're right, Lisa. Like at the end of the day, the movie is about aliens and it is about like fear of the unknown, but it's also about this awe and beauty of encountering something like this. And it's also just about like how we experience life and grief and loss and those sorts of things. And it's amazing to me that you can put all of that into one movie.
Well, I completely agree about how amazing it is that they put it all in and it all worked. Nothing felt left out. I was just going to add too that it really deals with that age-old philosophical question of if you knew everything that was going to happen in your life, would you do anything differently? Because I mean that's sort of a question that she asks later on in the movie, and it's not hinted, and I guess maybe that's what I was mentioning with 12 Monkeys. That movie is almost about how time is fated, that like we can't change the past because everything that's going to happen is going to happen. But this movie seems to leave it a little more open-ended, that perhaps things could have gone differently if Amy Adams had chosen to act differently, or maybe not. But yeah, that would you want to know everything that was going to happen in your life, I guess, is the other question. Even if you couldn't change it, is that something is that knowledge you would want or not? And I don't know the answer to that for myself. That's a Pandora's box right there.
It is a Pandora's box. 12 Monkeys is a good, I think, comparison, even though they are like vastly different movies, especially tonally. You really can't make that comparison, but you can. And I wonder, because it brought up as I was watching this, I thought, well, is she able to change things? Because one of the things that is brought out in the movie is that the aliens are there because they want to give this gift of their language to the people of Earth, because they know that we experience time linearly. So like one thing happens and then another, and you can kind of only go forward but not back, but they experience it completely differently. So they know that in, I think they said 3,000 years, they're going to need the people of Earth's help. And so this is kind of a I'm going to help you right now with the idea that you know that we're allies and we're friends and you're going to help us later. And because that was what kind of this plot was built on, it made me think that even though they can experience time not linearly, almost as a circle, there is no beginning, there's no end, and they can kind of experience it all at once. But at the same time, like, they can't change it, because I don't know why they would be here trying to set up something in 3,000 years if they could change that event that was happening. So it brings up kind of that idea of free will that a lot of these science fiction stories do with these kind of time. It's not really time travel, it's more like time bending, I guess, narratives. If you can't change things, do you still, like, does that change how you live? Because I would think if we knew bad things were happening and we had the power to change them, most likely we would. But then that's asking us to give up a lot too, because you might be giving up some of the good with the bad. I kept thinking, Matt, it's funny that you mentioned 12 Monkeys. I kept thinking of the comparison. There's a Stephen King story called Afterlife that I read it in Bazaar of Bad Dreams, which came out, actually it came out in 2015. So very shortly, kind of the same time period as the movie version of this movie came out. I think it was maybe 2013 when it was originally published. But Afterlife, if you haven't read that story, is really a good one. It's one that stuck in my head. And the main character basically dies in the beginning, a really terrible death. He has like colon cancer and he's in a lot of pain. And so when he finally dies and moves on, it's a big like relief to him. And he ends up in kind of this office looking place. It's just very nondescript. And there's just a man with a desk with all these files, and there's two doors. And the man says, basically like, I've met you many times before because you always end up at this point, and I have two choices to give you. One is you take this door and you can go back and live your life again. But the catch is you can't make any changes to it. And you won't know really that we had this conversation. You'll just kind of start anew, but you'll make all the same choices. You'll make all the same mistakes. You'll make all the same, good decisions, and everything's going to end up the same, including like the painful way you die. Or you can go through this other door, which you've never made that choice in all the time I've met you. Because if you make that choice, then you're just gone. There's nothing. There's no afterlife. There's no anything like that. You're just gone. So those are your two options: either cease to exist or go back and live the same life. And it's one of these things, because it's Stephen King, I think he never gives you an answer of what this guy chooses. You kind of get the impression that he chooses, like he has over and over again, and to relive life. But it stuck with me, I think, for the same reason that this movie and this story sticks with me. Because it's like, if you know what's coming, even though you know bad things are coming, but you also know really good things are going to be there too. Like, do you choose like to live it, and how does that change how you look at it? Because in the movie, I think it does change. She wants to experience everything with her daughter. And in the story, the story starts out, I'll just read like the first couple of sentences, because I think it's really beautiful. Because I know you guys haven't read the story, so I don't want to take anything away from like your first reading of it. But it starts out like this: your father is about to ask me the question. This is the most important moment in our lives, and I want to pay attention. Note every detail. And I don't know, knowing kind of what happens, I think it's just beautiful that she knows what's coming, but she still wants to like stop and be like, no, I have to pay attention to everything that's happening. And it almost, I think makes her live in the present moment, whatever that means, the present moment much differently. I don't know. It's kind of a cool little detail there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you guys are saying, that what they do at this cyclical time is really fascinating, and what it raises about free will. I wonder if things could change. I mean, the heptapods say that in 3,000 years they're going to need humanity's help. And I wonder, like, I don't know. I don't know that we can necessarily, yes, I feel like you can see the future, see the past based on choices that you've made. But I wonder if there's also a way that you can make different choices. Like if Louise isn't able to help them, then they did what they thought they were supposed to do to make humanity help them in 3,000 years, but maybe that won't happen. And even, obviously, listeners, this is a spoiler, but even the way that Louise saves humanity is a paradox, because in order for her to see the future, when she was given the phone number and the thing that she said to the Chinese general, it has to have happened in the past. And I thought that was really interesting, because it kind of implies that there is a slippage, that there is a way that something could change if the slightest thing didn't happen correctly or was off. And she even says in the movie, when, Ian or whatever asked her if she wants to have a child, that she said yes. And I think the quote was she was going to do it anyway, even though she knew how it would end. And so I thought it was interesting, that tension between, is she following a track that she has to follow, or is she making choices, like she can see the whole in a way that we can't typically see, and maybe that influences her choices in a way, if that makes sense. Like she could still make choices, she just has different or more information than you typically would have if you were living chronologically. I don't know, it's interesting. It's mind bending, the way that the movie gradually allows her to like have this other way of looking at the world, or this other kind of perception or reality that the characters around her just don't have, because she understands this other language, or she has the key to this.
Well, and I agree with you. The movie is so frustrating in that it doesn't give answers, but that's what I like about it as well. But I tend to side with, at least this movie's representation is most likely, from my reading of it, that time is that what's going to happen is going to happen, and that she's not really able to change that. And so it makes the theme of the movie more about her choosing to continue on, even knowing the bad stuff that will happen, like the joy of having the child and being with her daughter, and the time that she does get to have is still worth all of the pain that happens at the end. But I don't know. It does leave it unanswered, if maybe there is a possibility that could that something could change, that there is a possibility of free will, just because, like you said, that the aliens are there with a kind of quid pro quo. We'll help. We're giving you this gift now for help in the future. Or maybe it's just to fulfill the fact that they will need the help in the future. I mean, again, yeah, like that's where your head starts to kind of melt a little. But I mean, I really too. I think well, I don't know what else I have to say that I didn't just already say without just repeating it. But I do feel like it is kind of her character, Louise, is choosing to go forward with that knowledge of what's going to happen. And I find it really interesting. And this is one of the things I really like about the movie and how it portrays it, is that in the beginning of the movie, she's not aware of all of this because it hasn't happened to her yet. But once she gets that gift of the language from the septapods, there is almost this awareness of it that dawns with her. And that's when she starts to use it, like you were talking, Mel, at the end, where she sort of takes a vision of the future to use that to get the information she needs in her quote unquote present, at least for the present of the movie. And I mean, yes, it is a bit of a paradox, but I really liked that idea that, oh, now that she has this awareness, now that she has received their language, the gift that they're giving, she's able to unlock time and use it to kind of slip forward and backward and view all of these points, even the points when she wasn't aware that she was doing that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I honestly think this movie is why I've had a headache all day. Like puzzling over that idea of a paradox of time and memory, because it even breaks down at one point she says in the movie that memory is a strange thing, and that in and of itself is just a line that you can kind of puzzle over, because when we think about memory, like the things we know about how our brain works is basically that when you remember something, you're remembering your last memory of it. So it eventually kind of becomes a game of telephone with your own brain as you're telling yourself, like, you're remembering something that happens, but then it changes slightly, and then you're remembering that part of it. And it can feel very real, things that didn't occur in that way. Like, we have memories of things that didn't happen, like all of us do. And that's a very strange, I think, thing to wrap our brain around. And for her, she starts to realize that I think she's almost experiencing memory as a premonition for like the first part of the movie. When she's encountering the heptapods or whatever they're called, I could not help but call them Cthulhu's through the whole time because that's just what they reminded me of. They were like foggy smoke dwelling Cthulhu's. But it's not till she begins to interact with them and learn their language that she starts having these really unsettling premonitions about things that haven't happened yet. But of course, she's just understanding time in a completely different way. I keep thinking about the actual language of the aliens and how it works, because of course, and this is part in the story too, because she talks about in the story she talks about how she learned Russian when she was younger, and she was like immersed in it. I think she might have been traveling abroad in Russia and she was learning Russian, and then by the end of the summer, by the end of like her travels, she was like thinking in Russian and she was dreaming in Russian. But she was talking about how like cool that experience was, but it didn't really change her that much because it was very similar to the way her brain worked before. It was still a spoken voice that she was hearing. It was just a different language. And she didn't experience language rewiring her brain, which I think is how they describe it in the movie, until she started learning American Sign Language, because then she was no longer hearing a voice in her head, and words and communication took on something completely different. And so that started like kind of first rewiring her brain, and that's when the book dives really deep into like the theory behind all of it. I think they bring up the theory very briefly in the movie, and it also like kind of dives into the mathematics behind some of this, which it's a really cool kind of thing to look at, because it diagrams a lot of this stuff out, which is really neat. But one of the things that kind of gets me about their language is all of it is like circular, and it almost looks like, it looks to me like when you have a drink and you set it down and the water condensation kind of leaves a ring after you pick up the glass. That's what their language looks like. And she talks about how in the movie she describes it as it's like if you're writing with both of your hands at the same time and you're writing a sentence, and your left hand is writing like the beginning of the sentence and your right hand is writing the end of the sentence, and you're going to meet in the middle. But to do that, you have to know not only what your sentence is, how you're going to begin it, how you're going to end it, but also how much space it has to take up on the page. And being able to kind of think through that. And I thought, oh, that was the first time in this movie that my brain kind of cracked a little bit, because I thought, no, we really do. We even write linearly. So this is something that's like kind of completely foreign, this idea of how but I think that tells us a little bit about how they experience time too, is it's kind of everything all at once. So I don't know what that means for free will. I mean, it seems to speak to both, right? Like at the same time, there's that paradox of, well, you're in control, you can make the choices, but also you know how it's going to end and you know the choice you're going to make. So does that take away the choice then? Is it just an illusion of choice? I don't know. That's about as deep as I want to go down that rabbit hole, because I'm worried about what it's going to do to my brain.
I do just want to say I love what you just described of as memory as a premonition. Like I really, really like that idea that if you're experiencing time non-linearly, that your memory almost becomes a premonition. And like I couldn't help but think, I think it's Will Wheaton had a memoir of his time on Star Trek: The Next Generation that he called Memories of the Future, and I've always loved that title, and I think that this would kind of fit into that idea of a memory of the future. But that's kind of all I want to say there. But yeah, I don't know as far as the time. I loved. Well, I did also want to say too what you were talking about with the written language. Yes, it does kind of look like a condensation from a coaster. It also kind of looks like a Rorschach test to me a little, with that, like that ink blot kind of thing. But that description of it that you mentioned, that really struck a chord with me. That idea of writing it with both hands at the same time. I mean, that's probably the best way to describe the way that they are experiencing time. If their time isn't going from past, present, future, but is kind of all looped around at once, or one giant ball that they can kind of leap from place to place in, I mean, that it makes sense that their writing would be this weird circle blob thing, because I mean, how do you start when there is no start? I mean, for them, there is no starting. It just is. Which I guess also, not to keep tackling stuff on, but are these beings immortal? Do they live in, like, do they die? Are they born? Do they have full consciousness of their birth and death? Or are they actually like immortal type things that will only end when the universe ends? I mean, these are all just hypotheticals, but I mean, it kind of begs that question of what must that be like to know exactly what your birth through your death will be like. I mean, it kind of hints towards that with the movie. It more focuses on her relationship with her daughter, who dies young to, I presume, is cancer. But I mean, what would that be like personally for you to know what those experiences were like? I don't know. I don't know that that's something I would want to have.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a powerful question, because I think we like to think that if we knew what was going to happen, we would still choose it because it's living. But I also don't know. I don't think that I would necessarily want to know, because our idea of living is to not know what's going to happen and to feel like we at least have some choice. Yeah, the heptapod written language is really fascinating to me. I mean, I'm not a linguist, but I wonder too if like the circularity of it also had to do with their perception of time. It's also interesting too, and then I'll shift us away from breaking our brains about time. I thought it was interesting too, Lisa. You mentioned the part about memory is a strange thing. It's also like, just because you can see everything in your life doesn't necessarily mean you're seeing it from an objective point of view as well. Like, it's still, memory can be kind of ephemeral, or subjective. And so I was thinking about that too while I was watching the movie. Is if I could see my whole life, everything I would do as a memory, because I'm unmoored in time, I'm seeing my perspective on those things, and that just adds another remove from it, because you're not necessarily like a surveillance camera watching all these things. There's always going to be that kind of subjectivity to it. I liked what you said about calling the monsters the Cthulhu's. Um, sometimes I think when you finally see aliens or monsters, it can be sometimes a letdown. I didn't feel like these aliens were a letdown. They were kind of Cthulhu like. I thought it was interesting that they're like squid like. I wonder if that's like the most kind of other alien thing that we can kind of think of. The way they moved was kind of creepy. There was like a pre-Stranger Things kind of thing about their hands when they were their tentacles when they would put them on the wall. I thought it was interesting because, like, they call them Abbott and Costello, but like, I really felt for the one when it was basically like murdered by the two military guys who went rogue. Like, I felt like during the course of the movie, these things that were very alien and kind of hard to understand, because we were interacting with them through Ian and Louise, we've come to empathize with them. It would shock me sometimes when the movie would pull out and show all the violence and the uh, terror and the people buying everything in the stores and the fighting in the streets and then the trying to attack the aliens. And when they saw a picture of the aliens, everybody was so scared. They started doing even more, committing even more violence, and there were cults. And I mean, every time they turned on the news, it was terrifying. And there's this idea that they came here and they must be dangerous and we have to fight them or stop them. And there's also a really interesting subtext to like how the different nations of the world won't work together and the aliens need them to. But yeah, I liked the look of the aliens when she sees them in person for the first time face to face and realizes they're way bigger than they ever even thought they were. I thought that was I thought that there was something very like Lovecraftian about the aliens, and that there was that kind of like it got you thinking about like what's possible and what could be out there, and also what would it be like for real. Like, how would people react if something like this happened? Would it bring people together or would it drive people apart? And uh I don't the scariest thing about this movie to me, I suppose, the thing that was disturbing me the most as I was watching it, even though it was an alien movie, was the people. Was the way the people were all acting, whether it was like based on emotion or politics. There was much more violence coming from the humans involved than there was from the aliens coming. I feel like this, looking back on War of the Worlds, this is like the complete opposite of that in a way. Even if the aliens come because we're going to help them 3,000 years from now, so it's self-preservation, they still came to try to give us a gift. And I thought that was interesting. The fear in this alien encounter is not necessarily of the alien. The fear is of what we will do to ourselves. And that struck me as, I don't know, it's an interesting theme to think about from, like, say, when the movie came out 2016 to today, with everything that we've gone through.
Yeah, Mel, I did like what you were saying about how this movie, watching it in 2021 feels different from watching it when it came out in 2016, especially just how we've seen how people do react in certain situations, in our case, like a global pandemic, and seeing, um, I think, the fear and the stress that how a lot of humanity reacts. I mean, I can't remember what my response was when I watched it then, because I did watch it pre, 2020. So I can't really say if I thought that it was realistic. Unfortunately, I think that was one of the things that made it the most scary watching it this time around, was seeing our, as humans, response to what happens, and how we're kind of our own worst enemy. And when that panic and that fear takes over, I think when I watched it the first time, a lot of the fear in this movie was the aliens themselves, the kind of walking Cthulhu's, as I called them. There's a line in the movie that still strikes me, is when Louise is first like escorted to where the aliens are. And it's a really good buildup, I think, up until that point, because it's a slow arc getting from when we know the aliens land to actually like seeing them. Because first the military comes to her and she lays out like what is going to need to happen in order for her to work with the aliens and learn their language. And the military isn't really willing to go that way because they're very much just like, just figure out what they're saying and ask them why they're here. And that's really all they want to know. And she's trying to kind of walk them through the process and have them understand that learning a language is not like that. You can't just learn a few words and expect to truly communicate with somebody, because you have to know like meanings behind things and connotations behind things, and you have to have an understanding of their culture. There's a great discussion about like the word weapon, for instance. She brings it up early on when she says, to ask another person. She says, if you're considering another person for this job, ask what the Sanskrit word for war is. And because that will tell you a lot. But, there's a similar discussion about like weapons and, is the word weapon necessarily, what does it connotate? Does it connotate something negative, or is it neutral? Does it mean something more like tool? And so it gets really into the nuances there. But she's trying to explain this to them, and then they go away and she's alone. They eventually come back to get her, and it's this great scene because it's what we would expect as an audience from an alien encounter, because you see you hear the helicopter and you see the flashing lights and you see the man who ends up being Forrest Whitaker's character standing outside of her door. But it's very like what we have been conditioned to expect from an alien encounter movie, flashing lights, loud sounds, strange people. It reminded me a lot of E.T. when the government comes in, and that was always the most scary part of the movie. But when she finally is at the place where the aliens are, she says, "What happens now?" And the answer is, they arrive. And that is a terrifying moment because you're waiting to see what the aliens look like. And both Matt and Mel have both said, this movie does not disappoint in how they look. They're terrifying. But it's people's response to that. It's the panic when they see the creatures. It's the panic when they know they're there. It's the panic and the fear over why they might be here that kind of causes the chaos. And I think that, watching it this time around, that made this movie, that was one of the scariest parts. There is a lot of cosmic horror in this movie. There's just a lot of existential horror too, especially with dealing with a sick child. And if time is circular and you have to experience that, more than once, that's terrifying too to think about. But memory in that way kind of makes time circular for us too, because I think we talk about reliving memory all the time, right? So yeah, I don't know if I have anything smart to say except this movie, I love it, and it broke my brain a little bit. And if you guys have not read the story that it was adapted from, Story of Your Life, it is absolutely worth the read. And if you search online, you should be able to find a copy of it floating around out there, or you can buy the collection is called Stories of Your Life and Others. So again, I highly recommend it. If you like this movie, I think you'll really enjoy reading the story as well. All right, well, I think that's it for today. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content, or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.